some of the fields that you typically ended on had something like IP Masquerena, strategies that you didn't necessarily need to have Spright Elf. It was nice. In certainly some of the longer, prolonged, grindier games, it was really nice to have access to it. But I think the deck fundamentally can function without Spright Elf, something that I think perhaps some of the more traditional Spright decks simply are unable to do.
Right, and connecting my earlier point, Spright Elf's main strength in the Runick, Spright strategy was to bring back Totally Awesome. So in the variant that didn't use Totally Awesome, the loss of Spright Elf to the Forbidden list is not quite as significant. And we'll see how that works out for Kenny now that Spright Elf is absent from his extra deck due to the change to the Forbidden list and the fact that he's using Runick Spright this weekend. To go back to a point you made about Runick Fountain, where you said there's nothing quite in the format like it, I don't think there's a card in the game quite like it, because it can draw you 3 cards on your own turn and then 3 more cards on your opponent's turn before coming back to your turn to draw 3 cards. And it's not that uncommon for that to happen. So that level of drawing, I think, is unprecedented.
Not even these pot cards in front of us could mimic quite that degree of drawing. With that being said, we're going to jump right into Game 1 here of our Round 5 feature match, deciding who will go first between Kenny and Ian. One of the interesting things, I don't want to spoil too much of it, we'll just kind of see it naturally play out. But in my opinion, Spright duelists need to make a lot of concessions in terms of what they want to allocate resources for in their main deck. It looks like Kenny has gone well above 45 cards and is actually incorporating the Runicks, the Sprites, with an additional other engine in there as well. So it'll be interesting to see if we can see the totality of his deck.
I'm pretty torn on playing such a high main deck count in a Spright deck, because on the one hand, everything's so searchable through Gigantic Spright, Spright Starter, and other cards like that. And even on the Runick end, you have Runick Tip to search for any of the Runick cards. So everything's searchable, which makes it advantageous to run more cards, so you have more options to search for. But at the same time, you do have such high-impact cards like Spright Starter and Runick Tip that you really would like to draw. So running fewer cards will allow you to draw them more consistently.
It does look like the duelists have drawn their opening hands. I think, based on their mannerisms, I think Kenny is going first. He is the one who's looking at his hand, which I would assume would mean he is going first. He starts things off with a copy of Runick Tip, so having well above 45 cards, at 47 specifically, doesn't affect his ability to open up with that incredibly powerful searcher.
Good for him. So he will be able to get any Runick card he wants from his deck and banish the top card of Ian's deck. Kashtira Theosis is banished from the duel.
That's useful. You know, the earlier that you get insight into what your opponent is playing, the better. You know, had he banished a card like Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, or perhaps a card like Triple Tactics Talon, Triple Tactics Thrust, there's a variety of cards which it wouldn't have been a clear indicator as to what he was playing.
I didn't see what he searched for, but set 1 pass doesn't seem particularly good for a Spright deck.
I believe it was a copy of Flashing Fire.
He might actually be in a pretty desperate situation.
Yeah, Pressured Planet is going to apply, no pun intended, quite a lot of pressure. Without having Fountain on the field, you know, sometimes there's a deceptive amount of interactions when Fountain is on the field. That is simply not the case, though, when you just set 1.
Right, so you are correct about the Flashing Fire. So he will destroy the Unicorn before it can search for a spell card or trap card. Sorry, spell card only. It's not the Ogre. And he will banish 2 cards from the top of Ian's deck, but now he's pretty much defenseless.
Ian's hand, though, is a little bit clunky. He has a copy of Lava Golem, which clearly at this point in the game didn't really line up with Kenny's opening. It would have been great had Kenny had sort of the more traditional Spright opening hand. In addition to that, it looks like he has a copy of Terraforming, which on this current turn isn't going to do anything. Certainly next turn he can search out another copy of Pressured Planet. So we see here Ian deciding to send cards off the top of his deck to the graveyard, 3 cards, and it looks like he mills 2 copies of Rysart, and I think that was a copy of Fenrir as well.
So he's just going to attack with Tearlament's Kashtira.
It's a very interesting opening couple turns. This is really just the testament to when neither of these decks really get their full plays. You know, what you can do to kind of nickel and dime some card advantage and also deal some damage along the way.
Yeah, I mean, the destruction from the Flashing Fire was key because getting rid of the Unicorn stopped him from getting a Kashtira Theosis, which would have snowballed into tremendous plays.
Yes, have that Unicorn resolved. Obviously, this would be a very different game. The problem here in the big picture here is because Ian has a copy of Terraforming, although he wasn't able to do anything with it in the first turn, there is the risk, though, that on the next turn, if he can resolve that, he's able to carry out all of his plays uninterrupted. Here, though, we do see a copy of Evenly Matched.
No, so Kenny may have deliberately taken his chances and not committed too many cards to the field so that he could then evenly.
Takes a lot of courage to set just a singleton Runick Flashing Fire, having a Evenly Matched as the follow-up and thinking that you'll survive, but it seems to have worked out because here he has Spright Starter.
Yeah, I think I did also see an Ash Blossom in his hand, so he did have a little more defense than his field would have led Ian to believe. But he special summons Spright Blue, tries to use his effect to get a new Spright monster, and Ian is going to flip Infinite Impermanence. So we'll see if Kenny has another Spright monster to special summon from his hand to follow up.
And depending on what Kenny can do, we also know that Ian just has a copy of Lava Golem in his hand. Oh, this is interesting. So at one point in time, this may have meant that he was going into Crystron Halka Frybrax. That card has long been forbidden. So now he's going to be going into something else into his extra deck. And it looks like it's going to be a copy of Spright Sprint.
Another point in time, it might have been going into Spright Elf.
This is true.
But Sprint is good. He's going to use it to send a Nimble Angler to the grave, which lets him summon 2 Nimble monsters from his deck. Looks like we're going to see 2 copies of Nimble Beaver.
Which is interesting, right? So we were talking about the strategy incorporating sprites with Runicks. I already commented on the fact that Kenny's deck list is rather high in terms of its overall deck count. I think some of the original Runick strategies didn't necessarily play the Nimble package. However, we see here Kenny valuing the Nimble package and the Spright package. And I'm really curious to see whether or not we see potentially another one of his engines here. Because his options here are probably to go into either Spright Jet or potentially... No, it looks like it's just going to be Jet.
It is indeed Spright Jet, so he'll be able to use that to get a Spright Speller Trap to add to his hand.
His decision here is to either go into the singleton copy of Smashers, assuming that he plays one. Some of these decks usually just play one. Or, of course, you can get here another copy of Spright Starter. What that does is it basically hedges against the possibility where you could utilize it to search out a copy of Carrot on the next turn if you need that as an interruption, or Red if you need that as an interruption. And if you actually can get through the next turn and save your Spright Starter, well, then it can actually just be another starter.
Yeah, a Spright Double Cross is also a very strong option if he plays it.
That's one of my favorite cards in the Spright deck. It has so many different options.
It really is so powerful. I see a lot of duelists don't use it, though, because they're afraid that if they go second, it's too slow because they have to set it before they can finally use it in the 3rd turn of the duel. So a lot of times you see it in the side deck for players to side in when they're going first and have that guaranteed ability to, if they search for a card, take it, set it, and be able to use it right away.
Yes, it does start to mitigate some of the effects of potentially having to go second with the trap card.
Okay, so he's just going to set the, I think he took the Smashers, right?
He did.
Okay, so he's set a card, I assume it's that, and he's got a little bit of interruption.
Yeah, so what's probably going to play out here is the Terraforming is going to search out another copy of Pressured Planet unless he's running an additional field spell that we're unaware of. But it looks like Pressured Planet is the option that he's going to go for. Then from there, I imagine the Spright Smashers would be used upon the activation of the Pressured Planet. Based on the opening play, I think it's a pretty reasonable insight from Kenny to assume that Ian doesn't have a ton of extenders based on what he started with.
He took 23.
Or he could actually wait for the monster to be summoned. I guess that could possibly be another avenue.
11. No, 12 plus 11, right? It's 3,000, so it's 1,200 plus...
Looks like he will wait for that monster. I think once the Unicorn hits the field, since he now searched for it, he's really going to have no choice but to use Smashers.
23.
Otherwise, I think it will snowball out of control.
Effect special? Yeah. That's all. No worries. Yep. Effect to search.
Okay, he let it hit the field and did not immediately deal with it. So Ian will be able to use its effect to search for a spell card unless Kenny can negate it now.
He's being incredibly conservative with some of these point of interaction. Based on the fact that Ian passed with so many cards in his hand, Terraforming is a pretty reasonable read as one of the potential cards. Ian opening this turn with Terraforming, it makes a lot of sense that would have been one of the cards that remained in his hand after the opening turn. So from Kenny's perspective, he probably fears whatever the card is that he drew, seeing as how Terraforming is not likely to have been that, or at least it wouldn't be as likely.
So now Ian's using the Kashtira Theosis that he added to his hand with the Unicorn. So all of this is happening because he didn't immediately take care of the Unicorn.
Oh, he actually started starters. It wasn't smashers.
Oh, he took starter.
Yeah, so we talked about that. Yeah, he actually ended up hedging. But he actually could have potentially used starters to get out.
Yeah, on the summon he could have gotten summoned red with starter, but then it would have just been destroyed in battle. So I don't know if starter is actually a solution to anything that Ian could otherwise do.
So it may come back to bite him that he didn't actually search out the smashers. I started to question. I think he definitely would have activated the smashers earlier.
I gotta get one.
Yeah, I didn't see what he took. I thought he took smashers, but if it's a starter, he's kind of left himself pretty vulnerable.
Effective summon.
It's kind of a weird choice with all those level 2 monsters he left on the field.
Effect. Attempt to go to battle, please. 32 still?
He summons the Scareclaw Kashtira, even though it's in defense mode. Don't let that fool you. It can attack from defense position and apply its defense points when it battles.
Which lets him take down the Jet. And now the Unicorn is attacking, and he's actually being able to utilize Unicorn's effect to look at the extra deck, banishing a card face down. This is actually the first time that I've seen a Kashtira Fenrir in Ultimate Rare on the field.
Oh, yeah, it looks really nice.
It does look very nice, which is in the brand new OTS pack. 21.
He banished the one of Zeus with Unicorn, so he no longer needs to worry about that hitting him.
And if you're going to incorporate the Runick strategy, you definitely can't fit more than one Zeus. You know, some of the decks, as we talked about earlier, that have these really vital extra deck monsters like Zeus, they might actually just play 2 copies. You can't really afford to do that in a Spright strategy if you want to incorporate Hugin and some of the other Runick cards.
Yeah. And since Ian did get to look through his deck, the extra deck, if he saw 2 Zeuses, he would just pick something else.
Absolutely. And here we see him activate Pot of Prosperity here in main phase 2, which was the card that he drew.
Oh, I said 3 in hand. Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah, okay.
Oh, I said how much?
Yeah, okay, I put 7, I think. 3.
So I think they're just clarifying how many he's banishing. I think the question, how many, was 3 in context to cards in hand and not banished. Almost assuredly, you'd want to banish 6 so you can see the full suite of cards, which is what they've just clarified here.
Oh, get counting.
Another planet.
Also 2 copies of Ash Blossom and an Infinite Impermanence.
They're all good options, really.
Wait, that means he's playing Cash, right?
I think that other card is the Ogre, Kashtira Ogre. And he's going to go for the Infinite Impermanence, so that will help him pin down Kenny's plays. I don't know if there was really a bad option there.
No, I'm pretty fine with taking Infinite Impermanence.
Yeah, for sure.
He still has an array of options here. I mean, this is, I guess, one of the options that you could have went into. A Rise Heart.
Oh, he's doing it, summoning it the hard way.
There's the potential where, had he summoned it already, and then the Pot of Prosperity could have banished a card like Goliath, that he would be able to use that interaction. It didn't seem to line up here with his sequencing. But he does end on a Rise Heart in defense mode, which is going to now produce the effect where anything sent to the graveyard isn't banished instead.
It's interesting that he didn't set the Impermanence across from the 1 face down card.
Indeed.
It seems like it would have been a better position for that card.
Now the Spright starter can, you know, you could have basically forced Spright starter as an end phase play.
Exactly. If you wanted to trade your Impermanence for it, but
Unless you add one?
But here, I mean, if you were going to use Infinite Impermanence
yeah,
by default,
This just gives you another normal summon? Okay.
which he did.
it at least forces it during the end phase, which may not have been as advantageous.
Yeah.
34?
But Kenny will instead resolve that during his own turn, the starter, and he will get blue.
Stand by main. Big thing?
Looks like Ian has Big Bang set, which is, not typically a card we actually get to see activated in a natural way.
Yes.
But with Big Bang, if a Kashtira XYZ is on the field and a player controls 2 or more monsters, they must banish monsters and they control face down, so they only control 1.
Ian only has 1 monster, so he will just keep that there.
And then summon effect, and then...
Yes.
Oh,
Main phase?
is that too far behind already? Or like to attach materials? Because I imprimed him earlier, and that's supposed to go to banish.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Yep. Puts me
Is
at
that still
62.
attach, or is that...
Yeah, because the starter's getting banished, a
is.
Rise Heart's effect will activate. It looks like they're figuring out if the Imperm can still also trigger the Rise Heart's effect.
It is a mandatory effect, and it's a relatively easy thing to fix.
And I will change it. Doesn't need to be. Oh, it's counted as a win. Oh, I didn't know that.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Got it. So this gets negated, and then this will result.
Sure.
So Ian is attaching all these cards from his that were banished from the extra deck to his Arise Heart as Xyz materials to give it all these extra effects or make it have effects once they're sent to the graveyard, or to trigger the effects of those Xyz materials when they're sent to the graveyard if Arise Heart is ultimately destroyed.
I will normal summon, activate effect.
Unfortunately, if you actually just activate a Rise Heart's effect, they would just be banished again. But yes, if you just naturally were to go to the graveyard, that would be a possibility.
Yeah, and that's really what Ian needs to worry about. Kenny answering the Arise Heart. So this is kind of building up some insurance against that.
So it looks like he has the Ignister Pegasus, and then in addition to that, Goliath, both of which add sort of these additional effects.
And then mandatory effect.
And now he gets to put Big Bang underneath.
Good. Sure. Yep.
2 in hand, yes.
So Kenny chose to banish his Spright blue face down, since he can only keep 1 monster. He kept the Gigantic Spright, even though its effect is negated for this turn due to infinite impermanence. And Kenny does have triple tactics talent.
That's a card that lines up so well against Rise Heart because the effect is mandatory to banish. So as long as you can activate a card in main phase, you're going to trigger the effect of a card getting banished and then the attachment as an XYZ material.
Do you think we're going to see him take a Rise Heart here?
Puts you at 785, right? Okay.
We'll see which mode he chooses.
That's certainly the mode that would prompt a Rise Heart's quick effect.
Map is fine.
Is he...
Yeah.
It looks like he is, in fact, chaining a Rise Heart's effect, so it looks like he'll banish the Gigantic Spright at least.
And then banish face down.
Gigantic Spright is banished face down. Kenny takes control of a Rise Heart.
And then both of them get banished, yeah. This one is, they're both face up though. Yep. And then the mandatory effect.
Cards continue to be banished, but this time it's Kenny attacking the Xyz materials, but he's going to concede.
Yeah, I just don't think he had anything to follow up with.
Yeah, maybe he had no way to get rid of the Arise Heart.
Puts me at 2600.
Well, with that being said, it looks like Ian, he did the thumbs up. He did, in fact, win that first game. And looking over to the table scores, it looks like Brian is up a game, so we're at least even there. And then table C, it's actually just even 1-1. So across all 3 tables, we're actually in a pretty neutral state. Ian's up a game, Brian's up a game, but then Fernando and Calvin are tied 1-1. So anything can happen.
Yeah,
He's at 85, I'm at 26.
it's definitely an intense match for both teams because it's so close.
So it'll be interesting to see what we see in the side decks. When you're looking at a strategy that Kenny has here where he's playing well over 40 cards, sometimes side decking can be a little bit difficult because you put a singleton card from your side deck into your main deck, but if you're playing 42, 43, in his case 47 cards, it's not as likely that you're going to naturally draw it. In a deck that doesn't have Pot of Prosperity, your only draw power it's a powerful one, Runick Fountain, but it is really your only inherent draw power.
Yeah, I'm always the optimist. So in my view, when you run more cards in your main deck, it's easier to side deck because even though you're less likely to draw the cards you put in, you have more options to remove. So from a player perspective, as the person side decking cards, I think, all right, look at all these cards I have to choose from that I can take out because they're not as good in this matchup, and choose from the 15 in my side deck to put in. So
There's definitely a balance. I remember, let's say about a year or so ago, there were some 60-card decks that were incredibly popular that utilized the adventure package, and it got so high in deck count that the players often just decided, I'm not even going to side a Cosmic Cyclone. If I play against an Eldritch deck or a deck that has Skill Drain, I'm just going to try my best. Hopefully Draco Pack's good enough, and if it's not, I accept defeat. Because if I put, let's say, 3 Cosmic Cyclones into my deck of 60, I have no way of searching it, no way of trimming my deck quickly to then draw it. I just have to naturally draw, and at that point it's so low in percentage, I might as well have cards in my deck that maybe perhaps line up better into the field as a whole as opposed to those singleton trap-heavy strategies. So it's really interesting when you have these, this deck at 47 is not quite as high as 60, so it is possible for him to draw some of these singleton cards out of his side deck, but it is definitely a concession when you decide to go this far above 40.
Yeah, don't say that in front of Billy. I'm pretty sure that's heresy.
Yeah.
But it is true, though, because when you run a lot of cards in your main deck, the cards you really want to side deck are ones that are searchable by other cards in your main deck. Otherwise, you're probably not going to see them.
I will say, if you do choose to side deck actual Runick cards, they are much more searchable than obviously any of the other cards in your deck. So if you do incorporate a larger Runick package, maybe perhaps transitioning out some of the Nimble cards or some of the other cards within the deck, you can go into a much more traditional Runick strategy. Because looking at Kenny's main deck, I'll be honest, he's only playing a pretty small and trim Runick package for game 1, but he does have quite a few more Runicks in the side deck, so maybe that's his decision point where he's deciding, you know what, instead of side decking in singleton cards to counter my opponent, let me actually transition more into a heavy Runick strategy.
Yeah, and I will say Runicks and Spright are currently 2 of the best themes for searching out cards, because Runicks have Runick Tip, which can search for any Runick card, and the Spright effects include searching for Spright monsters, Spright spells, Spright traps. But to go back to the point about the odds of drawing just a singleton card that you side in, while it is unlikely in large decks, I will say for Runick, it's not impossible, because you are often drawing so many cards per turn and filtering cards to the bottom of the deck to draw them from the top with Runick Fountain. So maybe there is merit to that strategy and using these 1 of the 2 ofs in the side deck and just hoping to draw them in your Runick deck.
For Kenny's sake, I hope he does better than set a Flashing Fire and pass.
That's for sure. I mean, to an extent, he successfully baited Ian into playing into evenly matched, but it definitely did not work out for him.
I believe this is a copy of
Runick Dispelling.
Yes.
So he's going to use it to special summon Hugin from the extra deck. Each of the Runick quick play spells has 2 modes. One that has their effect as it impacts the game and banishes cards from your opponent's deck. The other that summons a Runick fusion monster from your extra deck. Hugin has an effect that lets you discard a card from your hand to search for the fountain, which really gets the deck going.
So here we see the great synergy between the Runick cards and the Nimble cards. And if you are going to play the Nimble package, you do have the advantage of sending Angler from the hand to the graveyard to activate Hugin's effect, which now puts the 2 level 2s on the field, giving Kenny a much more robust opening hand.
So convenient that Hugin's a level 2 monster as well.
It really makes the entire deck. I can't imagine this deck functioning without that.
So he will use it in an Xyz summon for Gigantic Spright and use the Gigantic Spright's effect.
Ah, okay. So this is the sort of third engine that I was curious to see if we would actually get to see. Without Spright Elf, it's quite difficult to go into Totally Awesome, but it's not impossible.
Do you have to return 1 to hand or no?
Yep. So he
That was part of swap.
he is going to Gigantic Spright the Swap Frog onto the field, use Swap Frog's effect to dump another Swap Frog from his deck to his graveyard. And you're right, I think we're about to see the new iteration of the Totally Awesome combo.
I think he's probably going to first special summon a Spright. I feel like the Spright engine is a bigger priority than going into potentially just Totally Awesome. So I think it's pretty conceivable here that he had an additional Spright card that he now wants to activate while his field is what it currently is. So here we see Spright Starter go into blue, that goes into Jet.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Since we see the inevitability of a Totally Awesome hitting the field, or at least the likelihood of it, I wonder if he plays, it looks like he doesn't play Spright Double Cross to bring the Totally Awesome back. He's going to search for Spright Smashers with Jet instead. I think if he had Totally Awesome, I think that would probably be the play here, right?
No, I think at this point, you do definitely go into Totally Awesome.
Right, no, but for the search with
Oh,
Jet,
yes.
I think you would take the Double Cross to bring Totally Awesome back rather than the Smashers.
Oh, yes, if you have that in your deck,
if
100%.
you had it in his deck.
Yes.
So I think at this point, Ian must think either Kenny hard drew with the double cross and already has it, or doesn't play it.
I find the thrust, yeah.
So he sends here another copy of Angler. He should have at least one Beaver left in his deck. Absolutely. It doesn't look like he's playing any of the additional Nimble. Have you seen any of these strategies that utilize the other Nimbles in the Spright deck?
I haven't seen any this weekend. What is...
That's true.
He's Link summoning
Cards for this matchup.
another Link 2.
Yeah, it's going to be Buijin,
You played against this deck a lot?
Ashima. This is the way in which he's going to be able to summon Swap Frog. So this card's going to let him special summon Swap Frog from his hand, and then a Swap Frog from the graveyard, and then immediately conduct an XYZ summon, which will allow him to go into. Totally awesome.
Oh my god, what the?
The requirements for this are 2 monsters with the same level, which in this case you had to use 2 monsters, which is definitely something to note. You know, in this deck you might sort of get into the habit of just assuming that you can use Link monsters or XYZ monsters, but that's not the case. You do in fact actually need to have 2 level 2 monsters. But here we actually see Totally Awesome.
Yep.
We see Spright Sprint, which actually has an additional point of interaction on the opponent's turn.
At a bad time to resolve it. Yeah.
Can I cut?
Yeah, so the Bujinki Ahashima doesn't care, or for its effect, it doesn't matter where the arrows point. So he was able to link that to the Spright Sprint, and even though his arrows, he no longer has any zones open for monsters for the from the extra deck for Link Monster. He no longer has zones open to summon Link monsters from the extra monster deck. It's inconsequential because he has his Totally Awesome on the field. If he had the double cross, on the other hand, he would want to have a zone that a Link monster points to so that he'd be able to summon it back. So now I think Ian can just rule out double cross.
Which is insightful. It probably means he just doesn't play it at all.
Right. So Ian does summon the Unicorn, which typically is your ideal starting monster when you're playing a Kashtira deck, but staring down all these negations, we'll see how that works out.
So here is that Spright Smashers. You know, last game we sort of thought that he searched this out and made it such that it kind of surprised us where he didn't immediately activate it, but here he does preemptively activate it because he actually did search it out this time.
Well, that makes sense.
Jet. Yes.
Oh, Ian has evenly matched.
Kenny has Totally Awesome, so he'll be able to set it and maybe bring back the Swap Frog, I imagine, or well, the Nimble Beaver.
Nimble Beaver, yeah. Nimble Beaver for sure, since it's basically 2 level 2 monsters as a normal summon. It's one that summons the second one. So he is kind of playing through it, Ian, but he definitely needs at least, well, he probably needs more than one more good play.
Are you gonna use it right now?
Since Red's on the field, but he is summoning Fenrir, which is another card that will likely force a negation.
I mean, don't forget to reset welcome though. Yeah.
So he's probably, he's going to activate Kashtira Theosis first, because if he activates the effect and Spright Red destroys it, he might potentially be out of luck.
Yeah, in all likelihood, Kenny would tribute the Spright Sprint so that he can destroy the Kashtira Fenrir and negate the effect instead of just negating the effect. So the Kashtira Theosis is good here. Ian's hand is pretty powerful because it's full of cards that are a tremendous threat to Kenny.
Yeah, that's the thing there. We saw that we only get 1 Totally Awesome activation instead of the 2 or even in some cases 3. And as a result, if he trades 1-for-1 interaction into the board, you know, Kenny's interactions all are essentially 1-for-1 trades. And if at the end of that Ian has a way of going over the top, he might actually still be able to push through this field. We will see, though, over there, if you look at the table scores, that Brian has won for Kenny's side. So there's at least 1 match that's already in the favor of Kenny's team.
I'm so sorry. Yes, it is special.
Okay, so he's going to special summon the Rise Heart with the effect of the Kashtira Theosis.
That one and then the
Effect on the cost.
fourth one. No, the fourth one. Yeah, that one, yeah.
I'll banish 1 Kashtira card out of my deck. If
You
the
know the card
effect
in his
goes
hand?
through, you'll banish 3 face down, and it'll become level 7.
Oh yeah.
So here he's going to pay the cost of banishing a Kashtira card. Looks like he's thinking about Big Bang, but he may go with a different option. This deck has ways of recycling it with Theosis. Plus, Birth can also special summon monsters, so there's a variety of choices. It's not as clear-cut as always going to Big Bang, and then in this case, without having an XYZ in the field, he actually can't even do the additional effect.
So he chooses the Kashtira Theosis, which actually will let him bring back the Banished Unicorn, right?
Yeah, you let everything
Add
resolve
that
except.
Kashtira card
Yeah.
from banish.
Okay.
Yeah, it's important when you're practicing with a new deck like this that you don't just tunnel vision into sort of the big bang play, because that's the most logical play when everything's going well. You do need to know some of the additional effects of the Theosis when you can't just always just search out the big bang. You need to be able to, in this case, get a card like Unicorn back to your hand, whether it's to be used this turn or follow up into the future turns of the game.
Well, this is interesting. He looks like he's going to make a rank 7, and if he baits out the red to destroy it, he'll then... Oh, he already summoned a Unicorn this turn, right?
Yeah, that's what he started with, and then he got hit by Smashers, which is why it was in the banish pile originally.
Wait, what happened?
Ooh, it looks like we actually have the results at table C, which, if they are stopping play, I imagine that means that Calvin won, which would mean that Calvin and Brian have both won their matches, which would make it such that this match will not come to its original conclusion, because the matches of the other two portions of the table have already concluded.
It's unfortunate for Ian. So far, all he did was win a game, and he might be taking a loss this round due to his teammates.
Which is, you know, part of playing in a 3v3 YCS.
Absolutely.
But that was the first time we got to see Spright this weekend, which is definitely exciting to see.
Yeah, there are several Spright decks at the top tables, but we'll see if they stay there.
And which variants.
And which variants, yeah. There's a lot of different different ones. They're all good. And